Have you ever wondered what worlds have been made for D&D? Do you need an idea for the setting of your next campaign? Are you curious what the upcoming releases for Spelljammer and Dragonlance are all about? Then the next 2 episodes are for you. This week and next, we're diving into the campaign settings made for D&D, from where the game was formed all the way to the present day. It's time for some Eldritch History. So this week's and next week's episodes are going to be all about D&D campaign settings. These are going to be more of those overview episodes I referenced with the brief history of D&D, but essentially in previous episodes I've talked about various campaign settings, but I realized that I should give a brief overview of them as some of these haven't been released in years, decades in some cases, so I feel like it could be helpful for some people, and it was good for me to get a little refresher on some of these and learn about some new ones that I didn't realize existed. But to start at the very basics, a campaign setting is just the world in which a game is played. So I'm going to be talking about the campaign settings for D&D specifically, and I'm only going to be talking about the ones specifically made for and designed by the people making D&D. So no third-party settings, no license settings like the old Conan or Warhammer, or even the Critical Role books from Matt Mercer. And I won't be looking into the Magic the Gathering worlds that have been ported over to D&D. Even with all those constraints, there's still plenty to talk about. It's a reason this is going to be a 2-parter. So I'm just going to dive right in. The very first campaign settings for D&D were the ones by the people who were making the game. Dave Arneson's Blackmoor and Gary Gygax's Greyhawk. And these started as little more than castles with dungeons underneath them that would go on to grow into towns and then countrysides, depending on what their players did. But often stories are that the dungeons were so interesting they rarely branched out from there, especially in Greyhawk's case. But I'll start with Blackmoor because Dave Arneson didn't originally make it for D&D. He created it for a different game called Braunstein. And Braunstein was a war game, but instead of just being opposing sides, different armies, each person would inhabit a character as well. This could be a military leader, but it also could be random people in the town of Braunstein. And Arneson was inspired by this game, so he decided to make a medieval version of it. And while doing so, he drew upon the Chainmail rule sets, which was a game created by Gary Gygax in order to do his combat. Eventually, the two, Arneson and Gygax, would get together and create the game that would become D&D, and each use their home setting to play their game and play test things and make new stuff and essentially make the game. And Blackmoor is described as a frontier kingdom beset by enemies on all sides, one of which was the Egg of Coot, who was described as once a man, now an unknown entity. Some say it's a huge mass of cells or jelly. Some say it's a giant, thickly hided egg. Others say it's just pure energy. Some say it's just a mass of living rock. There are even some stories that it's just a guy still. This Egg of Coot ruled from a throne room dominated by ancient war machine. Some people think this egg was a reference to a common nickname for Gygax, since his name was Ernest Gary Gygax. It'd be EGG, or egg. And some people think it's a reference to him, but in actuality, according to Gygax himself at least, the Egg of Coot is named after Greg Scott. And he ran the Micro Armor Casting Company back in the day, who would make miniatures and stuff for wargamers. And he dismissed role-playing games as childish, and he said that wargaming was the manly hobby to have. So I definitely see why Arneson would want to make fun of that guy. But part of this description of the egg also gets into one of the more defining aspects of Blackmoor in that it had science fantasy elements built in. This could also be seen in the first adventure ever for an RPG, which is detailed in the Blackmoor supplement, known as Temple of the Frog. And the main antagonist of that one was named Stephen the Rock. And he's from a different world or dimension. He uses battle armor to fight, and he has these genetically modified frog monsters that he uses. And he was sent down to Blackmoor to do something. He has to report in to wherever he came from, or they'll send more people to overthrow him, basically. And although we do get some insights into how the world must have looked due to this adventure, there wasn't much info in that original D&D Blackmoor supplement. It was more about adding new elements to the game rather than being a campaign setting. That wasn't a thing at the time. And then Arneson and Gygax didn't quite agree on business practices, so Arneson actually left TSR pretty quickly. By 1977, he was actually publishing with Judges Guild, a rival company, just a few years after D&D was published. And with them, Arneson publishes the First Fantasy Campaign, which is a collection of previous works he had done, various notes and things from fanzines and other sources, just kind of lumped together. It's got some insight on Blackmore, but not much. It is where I got that description of the Egg of Coot, though. Then after that, he mostly focuses on other stuff, but then in the mid-80s, Gygax is able to patch things up with Arneson just before Gygax himself is booted out of TSR. And so Dave Arneson helped write the DA series of modules for the expert game of D&D. These were The Adventures in Blackmore, Temple of the Frog, an updated continuation of that previous adventure, City of the Gods, and the Duchy of Ten. There was a planned fifth one called the City of Blackmore. They announced it, but they never produced it, sadly. And then after that, Blackmore kind of languishes for a while. In 2004, there's a new version brought up under the OGL for 3rd edition. This was produced by Zeitgeist Games and Goodman Games. This was a book called The Blackmore Campaign Setting. Then 5 years later, Dave Arneson's Blackmore, the first campaign, is released for 4th edition, and this one was produced by Code Monkey Publishing. Sadly, that same year, 2009, is the year that Arneson passed away, so after that, there's been no more official Blackmore published. Over on the other side of things, we got Greyhawk, Gary Gygax's world. The original Greyhawk world was just drawn over a map of the US and not really intended for publication. Gygax was just making a world for his people to play this game in. In that original map, Greyhawk itself was located around Chicago, which is where Gygax was born. Greyhawk's most notable feature was its dungeon. It's what D&D started off as a dungeon delving game. And it originally had 13 levels. And if you managed to get all the way to the bottom, it would transport you to the far side of the world. And only 3 people ever did that, and then wound up having to walk back to the land of Greyhawk after they were on the far side. This 13-level dungeon was revised when Gygax made Rob Kuntz his co-DM so that he could actually play and focus on other things. Together, they expanded the dungeon to over 50 levels. And what's interesting with these 2 first campaign settings, Greyhawk definitely, and to some extent Blackmore as well, is that Gygax at least didn't assume that people would want to play in his world. He thought that game masters would want to make their own world to play in. So he didn't think there was any market for, here's my world, you can play in this. Instead, he just thought, no, you want to make your own world because that's half the fun. And he also didn't want to lose the countless hours that he invested in making it, because he thought that if he put out everything he had done in a book, then his players are going to read it, and then he has to go back and make all new stuff so that he can surprise them and they didn't just get their whole world spoiled for them, essentially. But while he was thinking that, he also was releasing some information about his world. He had spells with names like Mordenkainen, Bigby, Tensor, Melf, Otto, and Drawmidge attached. And there was 10 adventures set in Greyhawk between 76 and 79, which are some of the most revered adventures to this day in the game. You had things like the Tomb of Horrors, the 3 adventures against the Giants. You have White Plume Mountain. All these things are hinting at this world that it's becoming more and more obvious that, people are interested in this setting of mine. So Gygax, being the history buff that he was, he went and outlined 1,000 years of history for Greyhawk. The most recent event of which was the Eldritch Empire became decadent. The rulers lost their sanity, turned to evil, and started enslaving their people. And then the Overking Ivid V came to the throne, and the oppressed people finally rebelled. Gygax himself described it as the current state of affairs in the Flanace, which is the area where most of the adventures took place in Greyhawk. The current state of affairs in the Flanace is confused indeed. Humankind is fragmented into isolationist realms, indifferent nations, evil lands, and states striving for good. He also redid the map, so it wasn't just a map of the United States anymore. and he had a habit of naming people and places after friends of his. Greyhawk was actually the first supplement to D&D. Supplement 1 was Greyhawk for original Dungeons & Dragons. But even more so than Blackmoor, the Greyhawk supplement had basically no information at all about the setting. Then finally, after all those adventures and stuff, in 1980, for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, they finally released the World of Greyhawk folio. And this is the first real information for Greyhawk put out there. And this just 32-page supplement, it also came with a nearly 3 by 4 foot map of the world of Greyhawk, which is absolutely gigantic. And it briefly described all the places located on the map. It had details about geography, history, political states, and also the days of the week. Which, if you're curious, the days of the week in Greyhawk are Star Day, Sunday, Moon Day, God's Day, Water Day, Earth Day, and Free Day. It also had names of the month, festivals, had notes on scale and movement, so you could keep track of how long it would take from one region to another. It had how to address various heads of state and nobles. They had orders of knighthoods, and even a glossary of runes and glyphs to make like little puzzles or something for your characters. And during the first edition era, Greyhawk was the default world. It's where most of the adventures were taking place. In 85, Gygax started writing novels. This is in part due to the success of Dragonlance, which we'll talk about later. Though oddly enough, his novels were not the first ones set in Greyhawk. That distinction goes to the writer Andre Norton, who had played D&D and then wrote a book called Quag Keep, in which a group of gamers is transported to the world of Greyhawk in the novel. But Gygax wrote the Greyhawk adventure novels, the first of which was Saga of Old City, which starred Gord the Rogue. And before the first one was even published, he wrote the second one, The Artifact of Evil. And just a year after that, Gygax is forced out of TSR. He retains the rights to Gord from the novels, and any characters based off his actual name. As I mentioned, he liked naming things off of people in his life, including himself. There was quite a few things that are some version of Gygax. The creator of the dungeons of Greyhawk was a mad wizard, Zagig, and he's the one who would teleport you to the opposite side of the world. But he was able to retain those characters, but other than that, he lost the rights to all the other work ever used by TSR, including Greyhawk itself. And without Gygax, Greyhawk kind of entered a tumultuous period. TSR began to focus on other settings, and they never expanded past the areas already covered in Greyhawk, which Gygax wanted to explore the whole world eventually. Even got to a point where in 1988, just a few years after he's booted, they release a module called Castle Greyhawk, but it's a satire. It makes references to Star Trek, Marvel characters, even the Three Stooges. By people who weren't particularly attached to Greyhawk, they said this was a fun adventure, but people who liked Greyhawk were like, what, are you just insulting Gygax at this point? And then once second edition came about, Greyhawk really moved away from Gygax's and even Kuntz's visions. They put out new products detailing the city and ruins of Greyhawk, which aren't really based off what had come before. They restructure the Circle of Eight, which was a group of adventurers put together by Gygax, which now becomes a group of powerful wizards and use more of a plot device than anything else. They have the Greyhawk Wars, both in the adventures and even its own war game. And with this, they basically wipe the slate clean on Greyhawk. After which, the Circle of Eight is broken up. There's new lands in the world. There's a new conflict, this time detailing fights against the land of Ayuz, this evil demigod character. And then by 1994, they canceled the books that were in production, and then TSR never made another Greyhawk book. But in 1998, after Wizards of the Coast owns D&D, their first major initiatives were to revive Greyhawk and to make the third edition of the game. And in 1999, it's the 25th anniversary of D&D, and they put out a line of Return to Blank adventures, where they went back to a bunch of previous adventures, most of which were set in Greyhawk. And for third edition, they make Greyhawk the default setting and have Living Greyhawk, which is for organized play. And there's 30 regions of Greyhawk are tied to real world areas where you would be playing. They put out the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer, which is the most in-depth look at Greyhawk ever. But with all that, Wizards essentially just left Greyhawk to the organized play group, and they only really have a handful of releases during the 3rd edition era. Then during 4th edition, Greyhawk's no longer the default. They, in fact, ended the Living Greyhawk at Origins of 2008. And the biggest release for Greyhawk during the 4th edition era was updating Gygax's Village of Hamlet adventure. 5th edition is a little better. There's references to Greyhawk in the core rulebooks. And then there's also Tales from the Yawning Portal and Ghosts of Saltmarsh, both of which update older adventures, most of which are from Greyhawk. And then there's advice for playing through both in the world of Greyhawk. There's also a bit of a random sub-setting in Greyhawk called the Sundered Empire, and Wizards of the Coast updated the Chainmail game in 2002. Originally it was going to be set on its own place, but then they kind of went back and forth about it, and then they decided, no, we'll put this in the world of Greyhawk. This Sundered Empire is set on the far western shore of Orc, which is officially part of the Greyhawk setting. My issue with trying to do a roundup of Blackmoor and Greyhawk, probably more so Greyhawk than Blackmoor, is that it's hard to pick out what made them distinct in the frame of D&D because it's what makes D&D distinct. So many things that were developed for them are such fundamental aspects of the game now that what made them unique and different at the time is just part of the DNA of playing D&D. Things like the thief, or the paladin, or the monk, or the assassin, monsters like beholders or displacer beasts, or the different types of dragons are developed in these settings. More so Greyhawk than Blackmoor. I feel the issues with Arneson and TSR or Gygax really hindered the amount that setting could have impacted. But again, it is where D&D was born. It was where it was formed. So many things are just baked into these settings that are D&D tropes at this point. I guess that's what happens after 40, 50 years almost of these were the original D&D settings. So once you get past these two, things start having to stand out a bit more from the crowd in order to be reason for these settings to be a thing. So with that in mind, we're going on to settings that began further along in development, starting with the default setting for the basic edition of the game, which became known as Mystara, but was originally just known as the Known World. And this was developed by Lawrence Schick and Tom Moldvay and began in 1981 with the module X1, Isle of Dread. It wouldn't actually be called Mystara until a decade later in the letters section of Dragon magazine, actually. And the basic premise of this is that the known world is supposed to be a shared universe, kind of like how Lovecraft tried to make a shared universe by dragging in things from different authors and encouraging them to use elements from his stories in theirs as well. And it was specifically designed to have different dungeon masters running through it and adding various elements to the games. So there'd be fictional nations based off real-world historical cultures, a trend we'll see later on as well. And the continents themselves resemble the Earth from millions and millions of years ago. But still, essentially, it's been described as a traditional Tolkien-esque world. A unique aspect of it is that Mystara had these ascended immortals instead of having the gods, which you could eventually become if you played through the BECMI series of games. And the setting was originally sought after to differentiate basic from advanced Dungeons & Dragons. The AD&D modules were baseline Greyhawk, so they wanted a different setting to help differentiate them. But this split between editions also eventually led to the downfall of Mystara, because by the mid-90s, the fans are really shifting towards advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which led to eventually there were some Mystara adventures being released for AD&D between 94 and 96. After that, support for the setting was transferred over to the official fan site called Vaults of Pandius during the 3rd edition era. But after that, Mystara hasn't seen any official support. But it did have quite a few subsettings, including Hollow World, which the storyline of that is that the world of Mystara is actually hollow, and the interior surface is surrounding this miniature red sun, so it's never dark there. And this whole hollow planet is based off the hollow earth theory that a lot of writers, including Edgar Allan Poe, Jules Verne, and Edgar Rice Burroughs, played off of in various writings. And with Hollow World specifically, it acted as a cultural museum of extinct societies of the outer world. It even had dinosaurs. But its existence is basically unknown to the outer world. You could gain access by going through the poles of the planet, which were giant, gently curving holes, and you could walk through without realizing what was happening. That's how gentle the slope was. But the poles themselves are really cold, they're unlit, and they're eternally stormy, and there's anti-magic things going on, so making the trek is difficult. I've heard some designers say later on that they should have integrated Mystara with Hollow World more so that you could flip-flop, because otherwise, like what would come to happen with having so many campaign settings, that you kind of divide your fans into different bases. But we'll talk more about that later. Another subsetting for Mystara was the Savage Coast. And this part is affected by this red curse. It's a sinister enchantment, and it eventually kills its inhabitants through mutation unless they have the fictional metal Cinnabril. And you need to have this metal in contact with your body in order to escape the effects of the red curse. And the red curse would affect you physically as well as mentally, and it essentially trapped people in the area because if you ever left, you'd go through different debilitating effects. Along with that, the Savage Coast was set apart by having more of a swashbuckling flavor. It even had smoke powder, aka gunpowder, so you'd have guns in this area. And it was based off the age of exploration. Another subsetting of Mystara is called Thunder Rift. This was designed to be accessible and droppable anywhere. It's this area surrounded by impassable mountains and really focuses on wilderness exploration. And although it is droppable anywhere, it was always intended to be part of Mystara, which is why I'm including it here. And the final subsetting for Mystara is actually a setting we've heard of before. It's Blackmoor. And when Arneson came back to write his adventures, the DA series for Expert, they retconned it so that Blackmoor was actually the distant past of Mystara. And they explained the differences by saying that the feudal society of Blackmoor evolved to be technologically advanced, so going along with that science fantasy feel. And then eventually it destroyed itself in an apocalyptic explosion that changed both the climate and the geography of the entire planet, which is how they're able to get away with saying, oh, this is Blackmoor, even though it looks nothing like Blackmoor. And all of these subsettings, and I don't think any subsetting has ever made it past the edition that it was introduced in. Most of them only last a couple years before fading off. And while Mystara is holding down the fort for the basic edition of the game, Advanced has the default of Greyhawk, but it also started developing new settings, the first of which was Dragonlance. This came about in 1984 due to Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. And Dragonlance takes place on the world of Krynn, whose history is best divided into various ages. The first age is the time of creation, when the gods are born and Krynn itself is formed. The second age is the Age of Dreams, which sees the rise of civilization and races, including the human, elf, dwarf, gnomes, minotaur, and most importantly, probably Kender, which is their version of halflings, essentially, if you really want to boil it down. But the Kender are described as brave, fearless, taunting, and cute. They have an insatiable curiosity and, quote, an innocent tendency to borrow things for indeterminate periods of time, which has led them to be very divisive in the fandom. The second age is also the time of the Dragon Wars and the creation of the eponymous Dragon Lances, magical artifacts with the purpose of killing evil dragons. They're made using a special material called dragon metal and by utilizing 2 different god-blessed artifacts. You can also make lesser ones if you have less of these ingredients, but you need all of them to make a true dragon lance. The third age is known as the Age of Might. The biggest thing that happened here is the Cataclysm. This almost apocalyptic event in which kingdoms and countries are destroyed, the seas themselves change, and afterwards the gods, dragons, and healing magic disappear from the world. And after that, they entered into the fourth age, the Age of Despair. a 300-year depression, which is where the origins of the setting takes place, specifically with the War of the Lance, which saw the heroes of the Lance, a group of adventurers, fighting against the forces of Takisis, the evil dragon goddess. It also saw the creation of the Draconians, who are made by corrupting dragon eggs into these humanoid dragon creatures, which are, from what I've heard, the first dragon folk in D&D. So before Dragonborn and all that stuff. So, real world year, 1984, sees the release of the module Dragons of Despair and the book Dragons of Autumn Twilight. The first releases for Dragonlance, and they tell the same story. The module tells the first part of the book. And the module even encourages you to play as the heroes from the book. If you read the book and you're familiar with the module, you can essentially point out every encounter from the module in the book. Everything they do is, oh, yeah, you could do this if you go this way or whatever. But eventually the books started coming out quicker than the adventures, and the story diverged more and more as time went on, so it wasn't quite one for one. And the novels themselves became bestsellers to the point where there's more than 190 Dragonlance novels now, which is madness. Just incredible that there's that many based off an RPG setting. The original trilogy was accompanied by a whole bunch of modules, the longest module path that TSR had done at that point. There was 12 different ones, which was essentially boiled down to a Dragon of the Month, which Tracy Hickman was opposed to just doing a Dragon of the Month, like, oh, this time you'll face a red dragon or whatever. You can break it down that much, but it wasn't as simple. Some of them, there'd just be a passing reference to whatever dragon was involved there. Hickman is very much about story first. He wants it to be a good story before meeting a criteria, like, you have to have a silver dragon in this one. It's like, okay, there will be one, but I'm not going to hurt the story by putting in this specific encounter. And you might be wondering, 12, but there's only 10 different types of dragons, 5 chromatic and 5 metallic dragons. But then there's also one for the god of the good dragons, Paladine, and then one for the goddess of the evil dragons, Takisis. Now, a major element to the Dragonlance setting is its wars. The first group of adventures, the first series of books is about the War of the Lance. And that continues to be the case throughout. Eventually also had the Chaos War or the War of Souls. And this is even reflected in the modules. Many of them are tied into TSR's battle system, which is rules for having warfare in your game. And even module DL11, Dragons of Glory, is a war game. And that Chaos War I mentioned also has a big impact on the setting. In it, Chaos, who is the father of the gods of Dragonlance, he escapes his prison and he wants to destroy his children's quote-unquote plaything, aka the world of Kryn. And this forces the Knights of Solamnia, which is kind of a divisive knightly order where multiple characters in the series are a part of it, including one of the heroes of the Lance, Sturm Brightblade, but also one of the more infamous villains, Lord Soth, was a part of this knightly order as well. He may have not stopped the cataclysm when he had a chance to. So some people like the order, a lot of people don't. But the Knights of Solamnia team up with their counterparts, basically, the Knights of Takisis, in order to defeat the forces of chaos. During this war, a bunch of the heroes die. The gods once again retreat from the world, and it ushers in the Fifth Age, the Age of Mortals. And starting in 1996, Dragonlance Fifth Age is released, and this is a different role-playing game that uses a new system called the Saga system. And it's based around, instead of using dice, you use fate cards to determine what happens. But this was not financially successful, and Wizards canceled the line once they took over. Then between 2001 and 2007, Wizards licensed Dragonlance to Sovereign Press, which was Margaret Weiss's and her husband Don Perrin's company, and they included options for playing your game both during the newer Fifth Age, but also during the War of the Lance period. And then between 2007 and 2011, there's only novels released, and there's no Dragonlance for 4th edition at all. And after that, Dragonlance goes dead, essentially. until this year, in which we're getting the release of a new novel by Weiss and Hickman called Dragons of Deceit. We're getting an adventure/campaign setting, we'll have to see, for 5th edition called The Shadow of the Dragon Queen, as well as a new war game called Warriors of Krynn, which is said you're able to play it standalone or as part of your role-playing game. You can fight these big epic Dragonlance battles. Sounds pretty awesome. And Dragonlance did not escape the subsetting treatment. In 1989, they released a box set all about Taladas, which was another continent on the world of Krynn. In this one, the cataclysm had caused a sea of lava to form right in the middle of the continent. It has many of the same races as Dragonlance, but they're used differently here. There's the Imperial League of Minotaurs, which is almost an ancient Rome analog. There's the Fire Fleet of Gnomes, or Masters of Technology, and they utilize and sail on the lava sea. There's nomadic tribes of humans, elves, and goblins. And there's the Dark Kingdom of Thenal, which worship an evil god, different from Takesis. And then there's these huge armies of undead under their control. But this setting was nowhere near as fleshed out as Ansalon, the continent that most of Dragonlance takes place on. There's that original Time of the Dragon box set. There's a supplement, Taladas the Minotaurs. There's a handful of adventures. And then, like a decade later, they release a trilogy of novels by Chris Pearson. And then there's some comics by DC, which, again, nowhere near as popular as the main Dragonlance, which, again, probably over 200 books at this point, and dozens of adventures. Despite the popularity of Dragonlance, TSR was often looking for the next Dragonlance. They felt like it was only a matter of time before the line died out, which I guess in their defense, they did eventually kill it off with their Saga edition. But the first quest for the next popular campaign setting did, in fact, lead them to what is arguably their most popular campaign setting, the Forgotten Realms. If for no other reason than it just has the most volume of stuff for it compared to every other campaign setting. The Realms was created by Ed Greenwood, who's been developing the setting since he was 8 years old, just for use in his childhood stories. And the name comes about because in his original conception, Earth and the Forgotten Realms were connected. And we actually drew all our knowledge for our myths and legends from this world, but then they were separated, and we've since forgotten about these realms where myths of vampires or unicorns came from. And most of the setting for Forgotten Realms takes place on Faerun, which is essentially based off of medieval Eurasia mythology. And Greenwood discovered D&D in 1975, but he didn't really start playing until 78 in college. And the next year, he started publishing in Dragon magazine because he was hooked. When Greenwood ran adventures, they tended to have 3 characteristics. One was freedom. The players had the agency to do as they wished. When asked later about how he developed so much information, he said that it was necessary because the players were so invested in the world that he had to keep coming up with stuff to satisfy their curiosity, essentially. The second characteristic was intrigue. The adventures hid conspiracies, mysteries, and secrets. Going along with the inquisitive players, he had to have stuff for them to dig into. And then the third characteristic were events. The adventures depicted the realms as a living place that changed, which we'll talk about more about this later, but Greenwood's gone on record as saying that it's nowhere near as grand as the changes that would come later. He said that players had taken decades to even get to like 10th level or so. While there were events that changed things, it wasn't on the setting-wide scale that we'd see once the Forgotten Realms became a official campaign setting. So along with looking for a new Dragonlance, they also recently booted out Gygax, so they needed a new campaign setting. And Jeff Grubb sought out the Forgotten Realms because of Greenwood's articles in Dragon magazine. He asked him, is there something behind all the stuff that you're making here? Do you have a world? And he's like, yeah. So they decided to work together. Which I've heard the deal for it, he got some money, but nothing really drastic. But then also he got a publishing deal, which I've heard mentioned. I don't know if this is confirmed or not, but I've heard that the deal is that he gets to publish at least one Forgotten Realms novel every year. Otherwise, he gets the rights back or he gets more power over it or something, which is a bizarre deal, but he's written so many novels for it, and I could see that being the case. But in 1987, we get the Forgotten Realms campaign set. And even right off the bat, TSR treats this as the kitchen sink setting. They immediately have other designers and writers going into the Forgotten Realms. They retroactively have the Bloodstone Pass adventure from the battle system rules having taken place in Forgotten Realms. Douglas Niles writing a series of novels about the Moonshae Isles, the first of which is released before the Forgotten Realms set, but they have that be part of the Forgotten Realms. And then the next year, R.A. Salvatore writes his first Forgotten Realm novel, The Crystal Shard, which kicks off the whole Dris Duarden. Dozens of novels that he's written at this point, more coming out this year. And like I mentioned, there's reality-shaking events for the Forgotten Realms, especially during the changes for D&D editions. For a lot of them, they had something that drastically shook up the world to explain the rules changes and the like. Between first and second edition, they had the Time of Troubles, in which the over-deity AO punishes the gods who are doing stuff they probably shouldn't be doing, and he has them walk amongst the mortals. This changes magic. It causes the deaths, ascensions, and resurrections of a whole bunch of deities. And eventually, AO decides to destroy the Tablet of Fate and unravels the laws of the realms. And then between second edition and third edition, there's not really one specific to Forgotten Realms. Instead, in this one, they have the adventure Die Vecna Die, which I talked more about in my Vecna episode. But that ended with the alteration of the planes due to the actions of Vecna and the Lady of Pain. Their actions affect the whole multiverse, including the Forgotten Realms. But then between 3rd edition and 4th edition, the realm specifically gets the spell plague when the goddess of magic Mystra is assassinated. This causes the collapse of the weave, which is the source of magic in the setting. And the spell plague manifested as a storm of blue flames that killed whatever they touched and reshaped the landscape. And in the aftermath of that, arcane magic was altered. There's these plague lands dotting the landscape. In the lead up between 4th edition and 5th edition, they have the Second Sundering, which started when AO decided to recreate the Tablets of Fate, which he had destroyed in the Time of Troubles. This also served to undo basically all the changes from 4th edition that the Spell Plague had wrought, including the fact that Mystra and the Weave returned. As I mentioned, the Forgotten Realms is one of, if not the most popular settings of D&D, in no small part because of its extensive support. It's got the most books, the most video games, and the most comics of any other setting. It's the only edition to be officially supported from 1st edition all the way till now, 5th edition, where it's the default setting for D&D currently. But interestingly, Greenwood had never drawn out any other continent than Faerun. His players just didn't really go past that continent. But there's also left room for expansion into other areas, which would become expansion into various different real-world cultures, which Greenwood has said that he doesn't like how close that they've come to the real-world analogs. But these are the subsettings of the Forgotten Realms. First of which was Kara-Tur, which is East and Southeast Asia inspired. It was first mentioned in Oriental Adventures in 1985, and it was originally supposed to be part of Greyhawk, but they didn't specify where it actually was until the Kara-Tur box set in 1988, where it specifically said it was the lands east of Faerun, the main section of the Forgotten Realms. And Kara-Tur has 10 districts or region based off of different real-world influences, multiple off of different eras of Chinese and Japanese history, and also one's based off of Siberia, Tibet, Korea, Indonesia, the Philippines, Mongolia, and Indochina. But this was not the last real-world analog. There's a few more. A couple years later, they released The Horde, which is a quote-unquote barbarian campaign setting, which bridged the gap between the Forgotten Realms proper and Kara-Tur, called The Endless Waste, which is an eternal steppe home to nomadic horsemen, and it's Mongolian fantasy. The Emperor Yaman Khan united the tribes into the Horde, and in 1990, it saw 3 books and 3 adventures. It kind of overtook the Forgotten Realms setting for that year, and then they've never gone back to it. But it was followed up the next year with Mazdaca, which is based on pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, specifically the Aztec and the Maya. But it didn't just replicate the culture, but also the history. It had adventurers from Am, a country from Faerun. They played the part of the conquistadors taking over and doing a lot of the terrible things that they did to the real world Aztecs and Mayans. They continued this trend of steering way too close to real world history in 1992 with Al-Qadim, which is based off the mythos of the Arabian Nights, things like Sinbad or Ali Baba. This specifically mixed real-world history with the stories and legends of the area, but also with Hollywood conventions. This one specifically was designed to only last a few years. They had planned out 2, they got a 3rd, they said maybe a 4th, but that was ultimately scrapped. And these 4 subsettings, Karatur, the Horde, Mazdaqa, and Al-Qadim, have gotten a fair bit of flack recently, which is definitely justified. At the time, it was a bunch of white guys from the Midwest writing about various cultures that, at best, they were trying to pay homage to. At worst, they were replicating stereotypes and various ideas that they didn't need to go into. There's a reason that these ones have basically been left to the wayside since the 80s and 90s. But the Forgotten Realms got one more subsetting, which was known as the Arcane Age. This came out in 1996, and this detailed the ancient past of the realms, about 5,000 years before the current time frame, and it detailed the Netherese Empire, which was the source of a lot of the magical artifacts found in the realms, because it was a magical society. They ruled in floating cities, and they eventually fell because of magical hubris, where one of them tried to become the new god of magic, essentially, and wound up blowing them all up. The Arcane Age also only got a handful of releases. This was partially due to the fall of TSR, so maybe this one would have been more popular, but the timing was pretty bad on it. There was one other setting that came about in this time, and that was Pelinore, which is actually created by the UK division of TSR in their Imagine magazine, their answer to Dragon or Dungeon. This was only printed between 1983 and 1985, but the setting of Pelinore mainly focused on the City League, a city that was a league across or more. They wanted a setting that wasn't fully fleshed out, so it'd be easier for DMs to drop their own ideas in and not have to worry about knowing all the lore. My own personal issue with the Forgotten Realms at this point, there's just so much information about it that it's a bit overwhelming. But in Imagine, they had articles detailing just small sections or adventures in Pelinore that were also generic enough to be dropped into other settings as well. Some of them were specifically just detailing a building or something. So you could definitely, I'll just use that in my setting, which is pretty cool. But Imagine was canceled after issue 30. The editor, Paul Cockburn, continued Pelinore. At first, he had to change the names, but eventually he went back to calling it Pelinore. And he made a new periodical called Game Master Publications, but that only lasted 5 issues. So after that, Pelinore's been pretty much dead. An interesting side note for Imagine is that Neil Gaiman briefly wrote film reviews for it, and in fact his first short story, Feather Quest, was published by Imagine magazine. Just a cool little side thing I saw while looking this up. Like, oh, that's wild. And we finally get to 2nd edition AD&D, starting in 1989, which essentially could be called the edition of settings. There's so many new ones developed during this time, a whole bunch of vastly different ideas, but also potentially TSR just shot themselves in the foot with this one by dividing their fan base into various different lines, which probably led to their downfall. But the first of these settings was Spelljammer, which was developed in 1989 by Jeff Grubb. And the tagline for this one is basically fantasy in space. And it was designed based off this single image in Grubb's head of a knight standing on the deck of a ship in space in full plate armor. The name Spelljammer is based off the real world term windjammer, which were iron or steel-hulled sailing ships of the late 19th and early 20th century. In the setting, a spelljammer describes a type of ship, a specific mythical spelljammer, and it's the verb for moving through space. You'd be spelljamming. Spelljammer connected the worlds of D&D in a new way. They had these crystal spheres that enclose the solar system of a world, and within it, it's known as its wild space, which acts a lot like space as we understand it. They had ones for Greyhawk called Grey Space. Dragonlance was known as Kryn Space, and Forgotten Realms was in Realm Space. And outside these crystal spheres, which are actually physical spheres that separate the wild space on the inside from the phlogiston on the outside. And this was described as a rainbow-colored, chaotic, flammable material that supports the spheres. And it's based off of old philosophical ideas of what space was. But the spelljamming ships could navigate portals through the crystal spheres and also sail through both wild space and through this phlogiston. The spelljamming ships varied enormously in design, but common elements were a spelljamming helm, which is a magical device that converted magical energy into motion. Now, this is the most common and easiest way to move spelljammers. There are other ways, but a lot of them had these. They look like thrones, and magic users would sit and control the ship while their magic is siphoned off. A lot of spelljammers also have these fan-shaped sails that was able to harness the flow of the phlogiston or the wind if they're in atmosphere in order to help it navigate and move. And spelljammers have both an air envelope and a gravity plane, which allow for breathing and for standing on ships respectively. The basically hand-wavy nature of this is sometimes referred to as Groobian physics due to Jeff Groob developing it. When he pitched his idea of the knight on a ship in space, they were like, how does he breathe? He's like, we got dragons and magic. Why are you worried about that? The physical designs and looks of spelljammers was all over the place. They could look like actual sailing ships, but other ones were based off of creatures. The dwarves would just convert asteroids into these things called citadels, which basically looks like a mountain or a giant stone fortress flying through space. The Mind Flayers use these ships called the Nautiloids, which looks like a nautiloid. And they kind of became the mascot of Spelljammer. They were very popular enemies during the time. Then, as I mentioned, there's actually an entity known as the Spelljammer, which is a sentient creature and also the largest Spelljammer. And it looked like something between a manta ray and a scorpion. And it could move itself, but it had a crew that it made of constructs. And then anybody who actually got into its air envelope would be charmed and it wouldn't let them leave, and it would make them defend it. Sounds like not a great place to be. You're stuck here forever now. So Spelljammer was released in 1989, and it's supported through 1993. It gets 4 box sets, a couple of monstrous compendiums, 14 modules, 6 novels, 15 comics. And although short-lived, it definitely seems like a pretty popular setting for D&D, or at least the people who like it are very vocal about liking it. I mean, I see why. It's pretty cool. But with all that, this year, we're getting a return to Spelljammer. After almost 30 years, Wizards has already put out a monstrous compendium of various creatures you can find online for free. They just put out the first adventure of what they're calling the Spelljammer Academy, called Orientation. It's out now, also for free on D&D Beyond. And then later in the year, on August 16th currently, which they've been delaying stuff, so we'll see. But currently, August 16th, we're getting Spelljammer Adventures in Space, which is a 3-book box set detailing info for players, a monster book, and adventures. So that should be fun. Now, the next setting to come out actually owes its origins back in 1983 with Module I6 Ravenloft, written by Tracy and Laura Hickman. Introduced the world to Castle Ravenloft and Count Strahd von Zarovich. But it wasn't until 1990 that we got the Realm of Terror box set, which introduced us to the lands of Ravenloft, the demiplane of dread, which is primarily all about gothic horror. This demiplane contains the myths and is ruled by the mysterious dark powers. And it's divided into various domains, which are tailored to imprison and torment. It is also controlled by the various Dark Lords, the most famous and first of which is Strahd von Zarovich, ruling over the domain of Barovia, and he's essentially a play on Dracula. Other domains would recreate this homage to Gothic fiction, with domains based off of Frankenstein or things based off of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There's also other ones based off of Vlad the Impaler, or just general monster movie tropes of the mummy or the werewolf. It's also specifically noted that the myths can expand into any setting. They can basically find you anywhere. One of the Dark Lords is Hazlick, who is a red wizard from the Forgotten Realms. Another one is Vecna, a lich from the Greyhawk setting. Lord Soth is a Death Knight from Dragonlance. And then there's Sire 1313 and Dread Metrol, which are both based off of Eberron, which we'll talk about later. But essentially with these domains and the myths, they go out and they find the worst of the worst and imprison them in these domains, usually based off of something from their real world history. Castle Ravenloft was Strahd's home. It's unsure if it's actually the place or a copy of it. It's gone back and forth, but they'll imprison this terrible evildoer here and have something that torments them essentially. In Strahd's case, it's the eternal attempt to win the love of his brother's life, Tatiana, which he can never do, and it always ends tragically. And so, although he rules over the land of Barovia, he never really gets what he wants. And these lands are designed to be inescapable. They've only been escaped twice. Lord Soth was able to get out because essentially he just didn't care enough for the dark powers. They were like, well, there's absolutely no point. We're supposed to be tormenting him, and he just does not care. So he managed to get out. And then Vecna is the only Dark Lord who's ever managed to break out. He became a demigod and was too powerful for them and was able to escape. And Ravenloft was supported through 2nd edition, but during 3rd edition from 2001 to 2006, Wizards of the Coast actually licensed the rights to make Ravenloft stuff to White Wolf, who is most famous for making Vampire the Masquerade. Eventually, Wizards would release Expedition to Castle Ravenloft, kind of an expanded and updated version of the original adventure. In 2008, they announced that they were going to have Ravenloft for 4th edition, but it never really materialized. But in 4th edition, they did point out that the Domains of Dread are actually located in the Shadowfell. Before they were kind of just wherever they were. This actually gave them a specified home. Then in 5th edition, in 2016, we got Curse of Strahd. Once again, another updated, expanded version of the original Ravenloft module. And then in 2021, we got Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, which was like a new version of the Realm of Terror, which we got a bunch of info on various different Domains of Dread. A lot updated and revitalized for 5th edition to make them more unique and stand out. Ravenloft also got a subsetting, this one called The Mask of Red Death, which is actually a low magic fantasy version of 1980s Earth. It started off in 1994. It's a Edgar Allan Poe influenced alternate Earth where fantasy creatures and magic exist in the shadows of civilization. It included real life figures and then also 19th century literature characters for people to interact with. Like Van Helsing and Jack the Ripper and Dorian Gray could all be encountered in the Mask of Red Death. The Red Death itself is this mysterious evil energy that can manipulate the world. Its origins are unknown. There's a bunch of theories. Some say it's very much like a physical red mist, while others say that it's some universal force like gravity. But the effects it has are it's capable of raising undead, transforming people into monsters, driving people insane, moving whole areas and locations, and affecting the very fabric of reality. And it's an extremely powerful force that comes and goes at its own whim, and it's the source of all the evil in the Mask of the Red Death world. So very similar to the myths of Ravenloft, but taking a more active role in the evil. Alright, that's all we have time for on this episode, but tune in next week where we'll talk about Dark Sun, Eberron, and so much more. As always, thank you very much for listening. This has been Eldritch History. My name is Jacob Tomlinson-Korst. If you like this episode, please tell a friend, help grow the show. But until next time, may you always make your saving throw, especially waiting a week for the second half of this podcast.